Hi, thanks for joining me. If you're new to this channel, my name is Mindy Mandell, and every week I talk about one of Plato's dialogues. So this week I'm going to talk about the dialogue Charmides. It's not one of Plato's more famous dialogues, but it is an important one because in this dialogue, Plato is going to show us an example of the virtue called sophrosun. Now, sophrosun is a Greek word, and it's been translated many different ways. Some of the more common ones I've seen is temperance, or sometimes it's translated as sound-mindedness, or I've also seen it as soberness. Now, sophrosun is probably, of the four virtues, it's probably the most confusing one. I think even in Plato's day, there was some confusion, and Plato kind of plays with that in some of his later dialogues. Like when we get to the middle dialogues, we'll see him toy with some of the errors in the way this is understood in the dialogue Phaedrus. But a few weeks ago, I did do a video on the four virtues, and I talked about sophrosun in some detail. And I gave this working definition, that it's the state of mind of someone who is focused on wisdom, and so only desires what is healthy for the soul, or at least not hurtful. And I added in parentheses, at least not hurtful, because the idea of moderation is a key component of understanding sophrosun or temperance. So what we're seeing here and what we will see throughout this dialogue is that temperance is something exercised by the person who is focused on wisdom. Wisdom guides temperance and actually all of the virtues. We'll see how that plays out as we go on. But first, I do want to take a moment to look at the historical figure of Charmides and find out who is this boy. He was actually, the historical Charmides was actually a relative of Plato's. He was Plato's uncle. He was the brother of Plato's mother, whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce. And there's another relative of Plato's in this dialogue, a man named Creus. And Creus was Charmides' cousin and also his guardian. So Charmides' parents had already passed away, and Creus was his guardian. Now we learn very early on in this dialogue that Charmides was a handsome young man, and we find that everybody admired him. We also learn that his family, and of course that means Plato's family, was a socially prominent family. So Charmides showed a lot of promise. He really had the whole world at his feet. Despite that promise, though, the historical Charmides ends up on the wrong side of history. We're not going to see that play out in this dialogue. We meet him when he's young and still charming, as his name fits him very well, and showing a lot of promise. But the historical Charmides took some wrong turns in life, let's say. There was a war called the Peloponnesian War, which went on for some 27, 28 years. And when it ended, Athens' democracy shifted to a tyranny, and there was a group called the 30 Tyrants. Not the most original name, but anyway, there it is. So these tyrants took over. They only lasted in power for maybe a year and a half. They were overthrown in a battle called the Battle of Munitia. Now, Charmides, the historical Charmides, he was either one of the 30 tyrants, or maybe more likely was that he was not one of them, but he was associated with them. And he certainly fought on their side. And he was killed in this Battle of Munitia back in 403 BC. So he died fighting for tyranny. And by the way, this biographical information comes from a book by Deborah Niles, a very interesting book called The People of Plato, which looks at the historical figures who were often named in Plato's dialogues. Okay, now our dialogue today takes place during this Peloponnesian War, and the dates of the war are generally set as 431 BC to 404 BC. And so much of Plato's dialogues take place during this war. And just to give you some framework here, Socrates died in 399 BC. So he lived through this war and through the tyranny that followed, through the overflow of the tyranny, and he died in 399. Now the war started with a battle called the Battle of Potidaea. And this battle is significant to our dialogue today because Socrates fought in this battle, and our dialogue today, Charmides, takes place right at the end of the battle. Socrates has just returned, and he's meeting up with some of his friends for the first time since returning. So assuming that these dates are accurate, it means that this dialogue takes place in 429 BC. So Socrates has just returned, and he goes to a wrestling school where many of his friends hang out, and he's meeting with them for the first time. And so at the beginning, we see he's greeted by his friend Chirophone. We did meet Chirophone very briefly in the dialogue Apology. Chirophone is the one who went to the oracle in Delphi and asked if there was anyone wiser than Socrates. So they're childhood friends, known each other forever, and this guy's very excited to see Socrates return from war. He says it's been reported that the battle was very severe and that many of our acquaintances have lost their lives, to which Socrates replies that the report is pretty near the truth. And by the way, all of our translations today are by the translator Walter Lamb. Okay, so this conversation goes on. Chirophone wants to know if Socrates was present in the fighting, and he was. So Chirophone invites him to sit down and give them a full account. And then that's where their conversation begins. Now Socrates is not much interested in giving this account, but he does give it to them. Plato doesn't give it to us. Instead, he has Socrates say that when they had enough of such matters, I in my turn began to inquire about affairs at home, how philosophy was doing at present, and whether any of the rising young men had distinguished themselves for wisdom or beauty or both. So what we're seeing here is a few things. First of all, the dialogue is told in first person from Socrates' point of view, and that's significant because sophrosune, like all of the virtues, is a state of mind. If you study somebody's behavior only, and you don't know the motivations behind that behavior, you're going to fill in the blanks with your own state of mind, and so it's not going to be accurate. The only way to understand the virtues is to understand the state of mind of the person who is behaving in whatever the virtuous way is. Okay, so also what we're seeing here, and this is really, I think, our first example of Socrates' sophrosune, or temperance. We see that because he's focused on wisdom, he knows that the truest part of who we are, the part that is most significant of who we are, is our soul. And so he doesn't want to focus on current events, even significant ones like a war. He wants to focus on philosophy. After 4 years of battle, when he comes back, the first thing he wants to talk about is the state of philosophy and who might be interested in it. At this point in the dialogue, our star Charmides makes his entrance, and he makes the entrance of a Hollywood star. When he comes in, everybody's focused on him, even Socrates. And then at one point, Socrates has this observation. When I came to observe the other boys, I noticed that none of them, not even the smallest, had eyes for anything else, but they all gazed at Charmides as if he were a statue. So Charmides has that level of charisma. He's that handsome and has that energy about him. Now a discussion takes place with Creus, the guardian, and his friends there, and he's telling them that not only is Charmides handsome, but he's also well-mannered and kind and intelligent and blah, blah, blah. Now from here, I'm going to give you a nice chunk of Socrates' response to this, or his reaction, because this is also giving us probably our best example yet of sophrosune. Socrates says, by Heracles, what an irresistible person you make him out to be. If he has but one more thing, a little thing besides. What? Said Creus. If in his soul he is of good grain. And I should think, Creus, he ought to be, since he's of your house. Ah, he said, he is right faring good in that way also. Why then, Socrates says, let us strip that very part of him and view it first, instead of his form. For anyhow, at that age, I am sure he is quite ready to have a discussion. So what we're seeing here is that Socrates is not really interested in the way the boy looks. Yes, he has some attraction to him. He recognizes how handsome this boy is, but what he cares about is his soul. Now, to further emphasize this example of Sophrison, Plato does show us that Socrates felt some physical attraction. When Charmides sits down, sorry, my mind went there for a minute there. When Charmides sits down with them all, this is Socrates' reaction to sitting next to Charmides. He says, "I saw inside his cloak and caught fire." Now, this might make you a little uncomfortable to see Socrates having this sort of reaction to someone. And I certainly don't think that Plato is going to make it as a romance novelist, kind of cheesy here. But I think that the reason he included this is to emphasize that Socrates was human. There is a common misunderstanding that Sophrison is about overpowering your emotions or having no emotions, or it's about having the discipline to resist temptation. That is not really what Sophrison is. What we're seeing about Socrates is that, yes, he is attracted to the physical beauty of Charmides, but because he's guided by wisdom, it means that his desires are elevated above the carnal level. Instead, he is guided to want to help Charmides develop his soul. That's his desire. He's attracted to Charmides, but his desire is to help Charmides develop his soul. And Socrates really throughout this dialogue, and I would say throughout all of Plato's dialogues that feature Socrates, Socrates is a vivid living example of Sophrison. Okay, before Charmides sat down, Creus tells his friends, and Creus, remember, is the guardian. He tells his friends that recently Charmides has been complaining of having headaches. And so he suggests to Socrates that wouldn't it be fun if you pretended to have a cure for these headaches? So now Socrates had to think fast on his feet. And the cure he came up with was that there was a certain leaf that would take away the headaches, but only if a charm were said. He says, I told him that the thing itself, the remedy itself, was a certain leaf, but there was a charm to go with the remedy. And if one uttered the charm at the right moment of its application, the remedy made one perfectly well. But without the charm, there was no efficacy in the leaf. Now, if this were a novel or any other writing, really, and it wasn't Plato who wrote it, you might think that this is just like some dirty old man flirting with a pretty young thing. But this is not a romance novel, and it's not any other writer. This is Plato, and this is Socrates, and it's not just any dialogue by Plato featuring Socrates. It's a dialogue about Sophrison. Now, since we know that Socrates is our exemplar of Sophrison, I think that we can give him a little bit of rope here and see where he's going with this. So the question to keep in mind is, what is this charm? What is this charm that Socrates is talking about here? And he's going to give us some clues. He says, for example, you should not treat body without soul. He tells us this was the reason why most maladies evaded the physicians of Greece. They neglected the whole on which they ought to spend their pains. For if this whole is out of order, then it's impossible for the part to be in order. And he goes on to say that the treatment of the soul is by means of certain charms. So there it is again. And these charms are words of the right sort. By the use of such words is temperance engendered in our souls. So the questions we have to hold on to throughout this dialogue and even beyond other dialogues is, what is this charm that Socrates is talking about? And what does he mean by the right sorts of words? We need to keep asking ourselves, what kind of talk would engender temperance or Sophrison in the soul? Socrates tells Charmides that if you already possess temperance, as Creus here declares, and you are sufficiently temperate, then you never had any need of the charms. So the charms are what give rise to this state of mind that we call temperance. So, okay, there's another important quote for you to unravel. And then this launches them into their search of what he means by sophron or temperance. Charmides is going to come up with 3 different definitions, and Socrates is able to argue all of them down, but I'll just briefly summarize them here. The first one Charmides comes up with is that temperance means doing everything orderly and quietly. Then he suggests that temperance makes men ashamed and bashful, so temperance is the same as modesty. And then after both of these get knocked down, he says, I remember just now that once I heard someone say that temperance might be doing one's own business. Now, if you've read the dialogue Republic, you might recognize this as the definition that Socrates gives of justice. But it is rather confusing, this phrase, doing one's own business, and it has to be unpacked. He's not going to unpack it here, although he does in the Republic. But here he treats this as something of a riddle. He says that whoever told this to you, it's perfectly certain that that person propounded it as a riddle in view of the difficulty of understanding what doing one's own business can mean. Well, they talk about this a bit, and it becomes clear soon enough that Creus, the guardian, was that someone who suggested to Charmides this definition of temperance. And so now, as often happens with Plato's dialogues, the interlocutor is going to change. So now, instead of Charmides being the main interlocutor, we're going to hear from Creus himself. And he too has some definitions for temperance. He suggests that it's the doing of good things. And then with some questioning from Socrates, they quickly come to another definition. He suggests that they come up with this idea of self-knowledge, comes up in their conversation, and he says that this very thing, self-knowledge, is temperance. And I am one with him who put up the inscription of those words at Delphi, the words, know thyself. So now they're going to spend the remainder of the dialogue exploring this idea of self-knowledge. And Socrates has many problems with it. He says that if temperance is knowing anything, obviously it must be a kind of science or a body of knowledge, is the way the word is used here. And it's a science of something, must it not? It is, Creus replied. It's a study of self. And Creus resists identifying the subject of science of anything else than the self. He says, while all the rest of the sciences have something other than themselves as their subject, this one alone is a science of all the other sciences and of its own self. So it's a rather broad topic, and Socrates finds many flaws with that. And that's really where the dialogue ends. They abandon this definition, but they don't know where to go with it. And this is quite common in the early dialogues, that a bunch of questions are raised. We never find out what exactly those charms are, but it is important to keep thinking about it, and that's why I highlighted those questions for you. So the charms do matter, and what temperance is matters. But he doesn't give us any clear picture here, although if you look at the way Socrates behaves and you use that working definition that I gave you, you can see it playing out and you can start to get a feel for it. So now we're at the end of the dialogue, and here Charmides comes back in at the very end. And Socrates is going to end with some advice for the young boy. He says, temperance I hold to be a great good, and you to be highly blessed if you actually have it. Now, as one final note, there is another testament to Socrates' temperance that is relevant here, and it's in the dialogue Symposium. Now, in the Symposium, we are going to cover this dialogue in some detail when we get to the middle dialogues, but what's relevant here is there's a speech at the end, and there's a number of speeches in this dialogue. The very last one is by a man named Alcibiades, and I'm giving you here the Stephanus numbers for his speech. Now, we did meet Alcibiades as a young man in the dialogue Alcibiades 1, and we saw there that, much like Charmides, as a young man, he had the whole world at his feet. He was handsome and charming and charismatic, intelligent, the whole 9 yards. But like the historical Charmides, he too turned out to be something of a disappointment. what we see here in the Symposium is him as an older man, and he comes in completely drunk, and he gives a drunken eulogy to Socrates. Now, there are some comical elements to this speech, and it includes a rather comical account of the various times that he tried to seduce Socrates. He wanted to be Socrates' physical lover. Now, in the dialogue Alcibiades, actually, Socrates does call himself Alcibiades' lover, and I think that's where we get the idea that some people say that Socrates had many lovers. It's not true. And in the dialogue Alcibiades, Socrates explains what he means when he calls himself a lover. He means a lover of the soul. And we find in the dialogue Symposium that indeed Alcibiades wanted to be his physical lover, but he got rejected over and over again. And there's a rather comical accounting of that. And then Alcibiades ends his speech with this quote. He says, "And there, gentlemen, you have my eulogy of Socrates, with a few complaints thrown in about the unspeakable way he's treated me. And I'm not the only one either. There's Charmides and Euthydemus and ever so many more. He's made fools of them all." So what Plato is showing here is that indeed Socrates never took on physical lovers. He was always interested in developing the souls of the young people around him and the older people as well. So even though there is some speculation among some academics that Socrates took on lovers, there is simply no support for it. And in fact, Plato is telling us the very opposite here. The Socrates that Plato shows us was focused on wisdom, and he was focused on guiding everyone who would engage with him toward a healthier state of mind and a healthier state of soul. I hope that helped you get a better sense of what Sophrosune is. It is a confusing issue, even with the working definition I gave you. If you still have any lingering questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Also, keep in mind that this is one of the early dialogues, so Plato was introducing the issue and giving us some things to work with here, but he's going to develop it more fully in some of the later dialogues like the Republic. If you like what you saw here today, I would appreciate you hitting the like button. Also, think about subscribing because I do put out a new video once every week. Next week, I'm going to talk about the dialogue Gorgias. In Gorgias, Socrates is going to give us some of his Socratic paradoxes. He's going to tell us that it's better to be wronged than to do wrong. He's also going to tell us that if we do something wrong, it's better to get caught and be punished than to get away with it. So if you want to find out why he says that, I do hope that you will join me next week. Thank you.